So today we're here to talk about eConsent. I think a lot of you have been thinking about eConsent for a long time now, and particularly we want to touch on hybrid eConsent. So really allowing patients and trial participants to have a choice in whether they prefer to go through the consenting process on site, still with the digital technology. So we're not talking about paper here. We're really talking about next generation consenting solutions, or potentially fully remote using video. And I'm super honored to have Jennifer here with us. She's seen our technology, and she's going to talk us through what she has observed and what she thinks would work and would potentially not work. So really hope that today we're going to have a very effective session that's really going to help you design better protocols that take patient preference into account, and that also maximize the benefit that technology can bring to clinical trials. So we'll talk a little bit about what Sam has seen from the Lightship perspective on patient preference. We'll touch on a case study. Then we'll go through our platform with Jennifer, giving live feedback. So that's going to be very exciting for all of us. And then also we're reflecting on how to ensure compliance with eConsent. So pretty packed agenda, and let's just dive straight in. So Sam, maybe you can take us away with this first section of the webinar.
Thanks, Dirk. So we wanted to talk a little bit about patient preferences in the context of eConsent. And when deploying eConsent into any study, you have the opportunity, whether it's in clinic or remotely with the patient, it creates the opportunity for greater patient access in clinical trials, and also to consider their preferences in terms of being able to come into the clinic or stay at home where they may be more comfortable. And what we've seen, particularly at Lightship, is that patients do have a preference in terms of how they'd like to take part. Some people really would prefer to come into clinic and see their doctor and do consent there. Others would feel much more comfortable taking part from home. And it allows patients who, for other reasons, can't come into that clinic and see the doctor there and consent into the study to really take part when they might not otherwise. And what's on this slide is just an example of a study that's published, that's out there in the world, about a trial where they were able to enroll more patients and also create more patient access. So patients who were older, patients who were non-white were more able to take part when they deployed electronic consent into the study. So I think we're starting to see good results out there that using eConsent really does create the opportunity for more patients to take part overall. And so it's a nice way to start to incorporate more patient preference, better ways of patients being able to take part in studies.
And so do you think we should still consider paper-based consent processes in our trials, considering some of this research?
Yeah, I think the world is moving more towards electronic. It also creates, when we think about sort of a trustworthy, traceable source, doing electronic consent and things that are managed in a system, I think overall is a better way to push.
Yeah, of course, I'm slightly biased perhaps, but I would agree with that statement, although I can imagine that there may still be a population which would feel most comfortable just printing things out. So I think something important to consider. But today, of course, we're going to focus on the most accessible way of presenting consent forms in a digital format. Jennifer, is there anything you'd like to add to this point in particular? And sort of what have you heard from the communities you're engaged with?
I think, Sam, you have a great point there with keeping things paper as well, because there are those that like to print things, and the older community is probably more geared towards just having paper and reading it at their leisure. So I think that could be a benefit, but perhaps maybe doing it in their home. So when you say hybrid, I like that idea, because there's so many different options when you think about a hybrid approach there.
So I think to conclude the session, we have a polling question, which we can fire up right now. If that's possible.
All right, our first polling question is, what are the biggest challenges or perceived challenges for using eConsent? So I'll give our audience some time to choose a response, and you can select any of the following: cost or budget, regulatory concerns, data security or privacy, site burden or support, or patient adoption. So the question again, what are the biggest challenges or perceived challenges for using eConsent? Cost budget, regulatory concerns, data security or privacy, site burden or support, or patient adoption. I'll give our audience about 10 more seconds to get in their votes, and I'm going to close the poll and share those results. All right, so we have 8% for cost or budget, 29% for regulatory concerns, 26% for data security and privacy, 18% for site burden and support, and 18% for patient adoption. Back to you guys.
Thanks so much. Sam, is that what you expected?
That is about what I would expect. I think one of the things that we'll get to a bit later is some of the regulatory concerns and how to plan for that ahead of time.
Exactly. Yeah, that's I think ultimately still a very important topic to touch on. And I think just before we go into our interactive session, reflecting on a case study that is relevant in this context, a very cool IMI-funded project we did called COVID Red. So this is a trial that tried to leverage machine learning and raw sensor data from the AVA wearable to detect COVID. And this trial actually used a fully siteless setup using remote consent to enroll patients into the trial, and then ship the device to them and actually follow them using ePro. And I think it's a great example of how with novel methods you can recruit patients in record time. I think over a weekend we had thousands of patients coming into the trial. We had the national press advertise this project as well, and so that really helped drive engagement and enrollment rates. And I think it was a great example of how you can really enroll more than 10,000 patients actually in the scope of a few weeks. Of course, these were healthy participants, so always, of course, easier to tap into a population like that. But I think the same principles ultimately apply, leveraging technology to recruit from a wider range of potential participants, and leveraging technology to consent them remotely can really open up some of those channels. So I think it's time for the interactive session, the exciting part of this webinar. And so I think we can hand over to Frauke, who can sort of show us how this would work in practice. Thank you, Frauke, for already taking over.
Yes, thanks, Derek. Before I will show you how the flow will look like when the participant themselves can show their interest via a study-specific recruitment page, I will first quickly show you that as well someone from the study team, like a study coordinator, can invite a subject or like a participant in their trial by easily selecting the site they want to be enrolled to, the language that the patient is speaking, and then they can select the preferred consent form, entering an email address, and easily invite the subject to a study. And from this moment on, the subject will have access to the consent form in the study and can view the form. As the investigator, I want to now kick off the signing flow. And what it means is that the patient is in front of me, so it's not longer a remote study, but the patient is at my desk, and we want to sign together from the same device. So I'm on a tablet, for example, and I will kick off the flow. I first confirm that this is the patient.
And so obviously, this would involve travel already. So I'm gonna guess, Jennifer, that this would be your less favorite option. But I'd still love to sort of get your input on this process, where you imagine the face-to-face interaction and handing a tablet back and forth?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's fine. Everybody has probably a tablet, a couple iPhones, a laptop, a bunch of different devices. So I think that would be certainly doable. Of course, in the office with the physician, it's going to take them a little bit more longer time as well, right? Because you may have questions and you've actually been there for some time to talk about the trial.
Exactly. Go ahead, Frauke. And so here we first have the patient signing on the tablet. Then we require the patient to hand back the tablet to the patient and have them finish the process.
Yeah, so I just signed as a patient, and I can now return the device to the study team member. So I'm now handing over the tablet back to the investigator. And now the investigator can countersign the form with their credentials as well.
Great. And so maybe you can reflect, Jennifer, a little bit on, like, from the conversations you've had in the past. To what extent do you think there would be a group that would prefer this latter option, where for them that real human interaction face to face, not through video, is more important than, for example, reducing their travel time? For example, do you think there's a group that represents that view?
I think there is. I think, as I had said before, I think the older patients, maybe as you group them by age, could probably benefit by coming in and speaking to the physician. The younger patients, I also may see coming in and speaking to the physician. The children that are, have to have your parent co-sign, I think they would probably benefit by coming in. Possibly. There might also be a reason that they would prefer to do it from their home as well. But I think the middle, that middle grouping is probably more maybe like me or tech savvy and very fluent with signing via a video conference call. Yeah.
I mean, to be honest, that's my expectation as well. And I think as time progresses, that will become more and more dominant. And you can even have a first face-to-face interaction at a site. So I've seen some trauma studies where, for example, someone would be admitted in a trauma setting. Obviously, not a great moment to really go through a consent procedure, but you could tell them about the trial and the potential to participate, and then they would actually, as they've been dismissed from the hospital a week later, get the invite to participate from home. So you actually have sort of this mix. You can still tell them about the trial and inform them in a face-to-face setting, but ultimately actually going through the process in a setting where they're in a bit better state could happen remotely, which I think is actually quite elegant. Sam, what are you seeing sort of in terms of what sponsors want and how they incorporate patient preference here?
Yeah, so incorporating the patient preference part, I think, is helpful. When we think about using eConsent, I've seen it go both ways in terms of doing it in the clinic, and it may be sometimes the patient is consenting because they're there already, so that it's an opportunity to engage with them while they're already there for a visit. Or Dirk, as you brought up, if we think about acute care type of clinical trials, you may be in the moment with the patient and getting them into the study there.
Exactly.
And wanting to consent. So that's a nice option if you for those types of studies, to have a tablet that's handy and you can easily, quickly, but also electronically enroll a patient in the study.
Exactly. And so I would challenge the audience. I have it here on the screen. I think you can see that, right? So different ways of working. There's a lot of flexibility that you can achieve with technology. You have the ability to adapt to patient preference, and I think you can even in some cases allow both types of setups in a single trial if you incorporate that, of course, in the design phase. And so we have this setup that we just went through with a pre-screener and a landing page that takes you into the consent platform and then into a video call with the researcher or with the physician, and from that point on actually to be further enrolled into the trial, where you can have just a pretty straightforward design or maybe something more novel where you incorporate wearables or sort of other more forward-thinking capabilities. And then of course we have what we just discussed, a more hybrid approach where you have that face-to-face interaction, which for some patients may be preferred, or for some types of trials, and you actually still sign digitally, but do that on the same device as the physician. So a different way of working, and great to have that flexibility. And so I think we have one more polling question, and then we can step into the last section of the webinar where Sam speaks about compliance. So let's fire off that polling question.
All right, thank you. Our second and last polling question: how does your organization plan to implement eConsent in the next 6 to 12 months? And our audience, please select one of the following answers: majority of studies, some studies, depends on the study, phase, or therapeutic area, or not at all. The question again: how does your organization plan to implement eConsent in the next 6 to 12 months? Majority of studies, some studies, depends on the study, phase, or therapeutic area, or not at all. So I'll just give our audience another few seconds to get in their votes, and I will close the poll and share those results. All right, so we have 24% for majority of studies, 7% for some studies, 59% for depends on the study, phase, or therapeutic area, and 10% for not at all. Back to you guys.
I think we did make it a little bit easy with that third option. That just keeps it nice and sort of in the middle. But I think that is reflective of reality. Ultimately, not every single protocol is going to be able to support eConsent in a meaningful way. Although I think with this hybrid option, you should almost be able to incorporate it in any trial. So I do think that's what we should be going for, because it ultimately just allows for a much more streamlined workflow. Sam, so we jump into the last section before we head into Q&A?
Yeah.
Right,
and this last bit is, as we saw in our poll, compliance and regulatory sort of concerns with any new sort of technology, and how we do that in terms of patients and engaging them in a way that is really compliant, both from the regulatory perspective, but also when we think about ethics committees and how we're engaging with patients and making sure that's all done well. And I would say the FDA and the MHRA have both released guidelines in terms of how to implement eConsent that are two good resources to leverage when you think about deploying this into a study. And that's really that first bit of upfront planning to think about from the regulatory perspective, making sure you follow the guidelines. And then also thinking about, your patients in your study and how the sort of workflow goes for them. So what will the eConsent process look like inside the study? And setting up that, upfront, so that you're able, when you're doing the IRB or the ethics committee's submissions and approvals, you have all of that planned and ready to go, so that it makes it more of a streamlined approval process from that perspective.
Yeah.
The next bit that I think is really important for when we think about compliance is training. So making sure when you're deploying eConsent that all of the study personnel have been trained, they've practiced using the technology, having them really feel comfortable with it as they're starting to engage patients. We find is really helpful for making sure that all the steps are followed, all the documentation around it is completed.
Yeah, I think I proved this on the call that maybe a bit more practice would have been good on my part. So that really proves that point.
Yeah. And then also working with the patient, right? Jennifer, you brought this up. Some patients have differing levels of comfort with technology. So it's important to work with the patient as well when you're talking about, how does the eConsent process work for them? Do they need more help or support or time? Do they have friends and family that they want to talk to about the study? So really giving them the kind of training around what the process looks like, so that they know and feel comfortable with it is important as well. And then there's more of the technical support and making sure that when you're deploying eConsent, knowing where to call and have that help desk available so that you can call them should anything come up. And then also, having these, I think, tie a little bit to the training materials, but having that support around so that there's sort of documentation available so people can review it if they're trying to remember, how do I log in on the back end, or how do I do go through the workflow with a patient.
And so, Jennifer, what kind of support would you want if you were participating in a trial? Would you want to have like a 24/7 number you could call to ask any questions, or chat, or what have you experienced? Also, just very curious to learn your perspective here.
Yeah, I think from a technical perspective, depending upon where you're coming from, right? If you're at home or if you're in the office, a phone call would always benefit. You can always pick up the telephone and have somebody walk you through the actual process. I think if you're e-signing, it kind of makes it difficult to do what you're doing in the e-consent part, and then also chat maybe, or look at guidance paper. So for me, I would always like a person to speak to when I need help or assistance.
Yeah. Well, I think that makes total sense, and that's probably true for most of us. Although I have to say, personally, for me, I always actually like getting help through chat. But that's probably not what I'm trying to participate in a clinical trial. That's more when when a gizmo doesn't work, and it's more sort of asynchronous. So I guess when you're really trying to get through, just that live interaction will probably be superior. All right, I think we're up on the end. Jennifer, Sam, any sort of last things you want to give the audience before we head into the Q&A? Are we all set?
That's it. Thank you.
All right, great. So we have some time left for questions. I saw a few come in already.
All right, yes, it is time for our Q&A session. So thank you very much for that presentation. I will start with some of the questions that I've already received. So our first question, once a patient fills out a survey for one study, will other studies be sent to them if they fit those criteria as well?
Sam, do you want to take it from the Lightship perspective, how you approach this?
Yeah, so a part of that process when we're in the study, there's also a question we ask around would they like to be contacted about future opportunities? And if a patient says yes and opts into future contact, we will reach out to them if other studies come up that they might be interested in.
Excellent. Yeah, and I think that's the modern way to do it. Ultimately, I think patients should have that opportunity to opt into that, and to decide if their data can be leveraged to identify them for future trials. I don't think it should be assumed. And Jennifer, I'm going to assume you agree with that, but please share.
I would agree. Yeah, I would definitely agree.
Thank you.
All right, our next question, how do you deal with consent form changes after enrollment starts?
Frauke, do you want to reflect on that?
Sorry, can the question be repeated?
Yes, how do you deal with consent form changes after enrollment starts?
It depends. If the subject already signed the form and there's a study amendment with an amended ICF, new ICFs can be added to the system, and the subjects can be invited to the new ICFs as well. So their consent status will change, that the consent status is no longer consented, but is changed into awaiting reconsent. So it's clear that the subject again needs to sign a new form.
All right, and a bit of a follow-up to that question, how does reconsent work in cases of updates to ICF?
I think I already answered that.
Yeah, I think it's very similar. But maybe Sam, now you can reflect on version 2 of that question.
Yeah. So in terms of reconsent, that's the piece around when you set up the technology so that the patient can get the new version. I also like to do a phone call just to check in with them, make sure if they have any questions or want to talk through any of what may have changed in terms of an update to the consent form as well.
Yeah, that makes total sense. I think that's good to, in a situation like that, maybe give a little voiceover and not just an email saying, hey, Jennifer, I can imagine an email like that could be confusing, at least.
Yeah, I think from my reflection, what if you don't get the email, right? So
exactly.
There should be some type of touch base regardless, I think. If you don't get the email, you should at least get a phone call. And yeah, I think that's a great point, Sam.
Nice.
All right, our next question, how easily can a subject withdraw consent?
Frauke, you ready to answer that?
They have to reach out to the study team now, and the study team can then archive the subject, so it becomes visible that the subject does not longer wish to participate in the trial.
And Jennifer, what would be sort of your preferred method of doing that? I think typically you would want to interact with the study team when you decide to withdraw consent as impactful action. How do you view that?
Yeah, no, I think it's very valuable to have a conversation with the study team. I don't think that, in my opinion, I don't think that should be done via the web. I think there should be a conversation because obviously sites want to keep as many patients as they possibly can. But at the same time, if for any reason the patient doesn't want to be in the trial anymore, that should be a pretty valid conversation. One of the things that I could ask additionally with that is then if it's archived, do you still keep your consent form and have the login and still subscribe within the application?
Yes, of course.
Yeah, that's always a benefit. So then something else coming down the pike, you can always have information coming.
Okay. And so you're basically saying you wouldn't want a big red button where you say withdraw consent.
No.
After you come home after a long drive, you think, I just don't want to do anything anymore. Just do it. All right. Next question.
All right, our next question, are there any GDPR challenges when it comes to eConsent?
Sam, I think that's a great one for you. And there's always GDPR. I mean, that's almost a no-brainer. There's always GDPR challenges, but
That's what I was going to say.
Maybe you can add a bit more nuance to that answer.
Yeah. So I would say, from the technology compliance, it's, this making sure your platform and in any context is compliant overall is important. One of the things that you have to pay attention to is not only the GDPR compliance bit, but also looking at in-market, all the privacy regulations, depending on the country, because they do differ across different European countries. So the privacy protections are in place from the tech perspective. And then it's about, in any particular country, making sure you have all the right different nuances figured out on top of that.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
All right, next question. Do you anticipate a return to traditional visits or increase of home visits post-COVID?
This is, I think, a question that, a variation of this question. I think we always see and get. I think ultimately there's no firm answer to that. My perspective would be that I think we're already seeing it. We had this huge peak. It's going to come down a little bit, but I don't expect it to ever go back to where it was. So I do think we'll see a lot more remote consenting, and there's just so much more technology also available, so many more tools to choose from, and so much more familiarity with that technology that I think we can be almost certain that we'll see a lot more of this technology in current trials and upcoming trials. But Jennifer, what is your expectation? What is your view?
Yeah, I would say I would hope that would continue. I think that it just makes a lot of sense. We've kind of all been forced into this electronic world. So it's if you don't have an iPhone or a tablet or any way of communicating on the internet, it's few and far between. I don't see it changing too much either, but the nice thing is that it is available. So regardless of if things do go back the way they quote unquote were, you still have that availability to still consent via your web or have a doctor visit via a phone call or a video chat.
Yeah, great. Thank you.
All right, our next question. How do you coordinate consenting of a minor? Can the ICF be signed on the same device?
So, Fargo, can you talk us through what the approach is that we are working on facilitating that? How do you do that? Is that separate accounts at the same device? What's the approach?
Yeah, that is an excellent question. Because not always the minors have to sign. Sometimes they do have to sign. It really depends on the local regulation and the local IRBs. So sometimes they do need to create a new their own account. But some IRBs may accept that they're going to use the account from one of the parents. So it really depends on the local regulations, I would say.
Yeah, and I think the nuance there is mostly that it's not necessarily about the device, but mostly about are they using separate accounts for signatures, which of course, in context of 21 CFR Part 11 would be very relevant. Sam, is there something you can add to that?
Yeah, I was gonna say what I've seen done is separate, get the sort of the child or the minor in that scenario would get a separate account, and most of the time what I've seen from ethics committee is sort of older adolescents that need to sign, so they're sort of old enough that they are pretty likely that they will be comfortable, setting up an account being in an electronic system.
Exactly. So the easier answer, of course, as always, is it depends. But the good news is that technology can support more complex signature scenarios as well, of course. It just means a bit more interactions. Okay. Do we have any more questions, or are we at the end?
I think we have time for one more question, and that is, how much time needs to be added to study startup timelines when adding virtual or hybrid tools?
That's a great one. Well, we of course believe in making decentralized trials scalable. So I would say as little as possible. Ultimately, I think this needs to become self-service for when you want to really launch these trials very quickly. You don't want to have an extensive configuration process. But Sam, maybe you can reflect on what you've seen. Sort of, does it add any time beyond sort of the traditional trials in your opinion?
No, it doesn't add any time. Ideally, what we are all doing when we're starting studies is doing all this work in parallel in terms of study startup. So it doesn't add anything to the overall timelines, but you do want to start that configuration process and setting everything up as soon as you can to get the study going.
That's great. But I think ultimately, we should all strive to make these types of trials go mainstream. We stop talking about decentralized. We stop talking about hybrid trials. We just design more human trials, and we just call them regular trials. And we actually are able to launch them faster because they involve more technology and less paperwork. So I think that's what we're all striving for over here, and what we're hoping to bring to as many patients as possible in the world.
All right. Well, thank you very much for those answers. If we could not attend to your questions, the team at Castor and Lightship may be able to follow up with you. Or if you have any further questions, you can direct them to the email addresses on your screen. Thank you so much, everyone, for participating in today's webinar. You'll be receiving a follow-up email from X-Talks with access to the recorded archive for this event. And a survey window will be popping up on your screen, and your participation is appreciated as it will help us to improve our webinars. Now, please join us in thanking our speakers, Sam Eels, Dirk Arts, and Jennifer Arters. We hope you found this webinar informative. Have a great day, everyone.